Well, very good afternoon, evening, morning to everyone out there. Welcome to Mentor Now and the Captain Speaking podcast, because we're actually broadcasting this impromptu emergency live stream over two channels at the moment, both on our podcast channel and here on Mentor Now. And what we are covering today is the tragic events that have come to our attention down from India. The tragic crash to Air India Flight 171 and what we know so far. But before we go any further, we should introduce ourselves, I guess. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt. I'm the creator of Mentor Pilot and Mentor Now. And with me, I am proud to say that I have...
Good afternoon, ladies and gents. So my name's Ben Watts. I am the creator of Airline Pilot Performance. Similar to Petter, I'm also a Boeing captain, instructor and examiner. We'll be going through this together this afternoon.
Yeah. So maybe, Ben, what do you think? We should probably explain to people why we are doing this when it's so early after this accident has happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to point out is we don't know what happened at this point. It's very, very early on. There's a huge amount of speculation out there at the moment. What we're not going to do is speculate as to what may have happened. But what we will do and what we can do is look at the threats that are associated with a takeoff, a typical takeoff from our experience. And we're going to look at what the threats were associated on that particular departure, what that would have looked like if they were realized. And then we're going to discuss that and break it apart between us, shining a light on what the end results would be, and also taking your questions later on in the session.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point that out, that we are here mainly to try to kind of straighten out question marks. I know that there's a lot of them out there, but my team and I, it's super important for us that we broadcast accurate things. And we will be learning for every hour that goes on now, we'll be getting more information about this. For every day that goes on, we're going to learn more and more about what the actual causes were. But at this stage, there are certain things that we can definitely talk about. We can talk about things like high lift devices, flap slats. We can talk about threats around taxiing, backtracking runways, and what can cause the kind of things that we saw in the videos without going into actually speculating if that was the case here. So that's kind of my goal with this, and also to help anyone who's out there who maybe is a nervous flyer, who feels that today you want to hear from someone who actually has experience sitting in large cockpits and how we deal with things.
Yeah, absolutely. And Petter, so first of all, should we just go into what happened? Let's start with that, shall we?
All right. So very early this morning, our time, it was about midday in India when this happened. We got reports that a Boeing 787-8 from Air India had suffered an accident after takeoff from Ahmedabad in India, and the aircraft was going towards London Gatwick in the United Kingdom. What we do know so far is that there was 230 passengers on board with 12 crew members, making it 242 people in total, with 169 Indian nationals, 53 British from what the initial information gave us, and then several other nationalities involved as well. The aircraft seemed to have, it was supposed to depart at 13:10 local time. It actually started moving at 13:39, making it about 29 minutes late. And it taxied out using what looks to be an intersection entry into the runway. So they were taxiing down taxiway Papa and then joined by a Romeo 4. And then there was some initial speculation of whether or not they have taken off from there, but that it's been confirmed now that they actually backtracked the runway to get the full runway length. And then they took off, and we've now gotten actually two different video angles, where the first one shows that the aircraft took off approximately midway down the runway, which is what you would expect with a full 787 like this. It climbed up for a little bit, and then it just starts to kind of fall down, and it eventually ended up in a residential area about half a mile downrange of the runway, highly populated area, unfortunately. So far, we have learned that there is at least one survivor, which is incredible given the footage that we saw, but that there's also multiple injuries on the ground, and obviously a lot of casualties as well. So weather at the moment of the accident was fine. It was good visibility, no clouds around, pretty high temperature, 37
Yeah.
degrees, which we will get to later on why that is a problem sometimes. But generally speaking, a perfect day. I mean, 37 degrees wouldn't be considered very warm at that time of year in India anyway. So that's what we know so far. I don't know. Did I miss something there, Ben?
No, that's everything so far. I think that's what we've got to work with. And what we can do is kind of go into, what would the normal procedures be for that kind of departure? What are the considerations? So it's unusual, but there are a number of airports where you can't line up at the beginning of the runway, which is where you would typically aim to take off from. So in this particular example, they lined up from a runway that was a taxiway that was about halfway down the runway, because there was no taxiway that took them all the way to the end. So what the crew would do is they would get to the holding point, get cleared to what we call backtrack the runway. So taxi the wrong way down, all the way down to the end, turn around and depart from there. But it's not that common. So there are threats associated with that because it breaks routine. So Petter, do you want to go a little bit more into what kind of, or why that could be a threat?
Well, generally speaking, we do our checklist when we're at the gate, right? So we do the before start checklist at the gate, then we push back. We do our we complete our before start checklist. We start up our engines, and then as we're taxiing out, we tend to have a before takeoff checklist, and that, at least on the 737 that we fly, is divided into two parts. It's one part that you do before you get to the line, as we say, this is the holding point prior to the runway. And then there's a second part that happens after, so below the line. And there's different things that needs to be done there. And we are used to doing everything in the before takeoff checklist down to the line, and then we do below the line, right? Now, the problem with having short taxi out, I'm not sure that was the case here, but when you have a long backtrack, is that there's going to be a significant time of the taxiing where you spend on the runway, which means when you're on the runway, you need to have things like your strobe lights put on so that any traffic can see you. So there are certain things that might have to come a little bit out of sequence, right? And whenever anything is out of sequence as an airline pilot, there is a potential to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Right? So that's one of them, the fact that you do things out of sequence. I've been in situations myself where you get to, you backtrack, you line up the aircraft, and then you say, okay, so let's complete below the line. And then you realize that, we haven't even started the first part of the checklist. We need to do that first, which includes things like verifying the flap setting and verifying the takeoff trim setting, for example. Now I'm talking about the 737, but all Boeing aircraft are similar in this regard.
Yeah, and people might be wondering, well, it's just a checklist. So, you just follow the checklist, surely. But the thing with aviation is everything we do is very what we call trigger response. So there'll be a trigger, something that triggers something to happen. And that trigger will generally generate a normal response. But as soon as you go out of routine, you can miss triggers that would prompt the response that you should get.
Yeah.
And if you miss that trigger, there's a good chance you'll miss that response. And by lining up on a runway halfway down and not finishing those checklists to the line. And what we mean to the line is there's actually a line on the checklist. And the 787 has a digital checklist, but it's an old saying where we go to the line. And once we get onto the runway, we would go below that line on the checklist and continue with the before takeoff checks. But if you jump ahead and get on the runway now, your brain, you're so used to doing the below the line checks when you're on the runway, you can skip that whole first part. And all of that part is where we are checking flap configuration, stab trims, and so on. So it's super important that we always stick to the standard routine, however that may be. And we can even do our own checks. I'm sure you do, Petter, as well. Like I call them anti-embarrassment checks, where you've done all your checks, but before takeoff, I'll always look down. There's typically three things that can kill you on takeoff. One of them is not having the correct flaps. The other one is not a stab trim setting, which is how we set the horizontal stabilizer at the back. And the last one later on will be your air conditioning is not set up properly. So I just look at all three of those to check, are they set correctly for takeoff? But yeah, I'm sure you do something similar, Petter, do you?
Yeah, no, I go through something similar as well. And, but these, like, again, we have to really emphasize here that what we're talking about here now is general threats, right? This
General
is aviation ABC. It doesn't say that this is what happened to this in this particular case, but I think with all of the speculation that's going out on X, on Instagram, everywhere now, you are going to see people discussing things like flaps, for example, and power settings and bird strikes and things like that. So we are just going to go through this point by point to illustrate where the threats are, generally speaking, where people have made mistakes before. So the reason that we're going through this, obviously, is that there is a famous accident that happened to a Spanair flight in Madrid several years ago, where they were under a lot of workload, a lot of pressure. They were taxiing out. They were late. These guys were also late. And they ended up not selecting the takeoff flaps. And then they ended up on the runway without the takeoff flap set, setting the takeoff thrust and taking off without the flap set. And the problem is that an aircraft just will not fly if the flaps are not set. And maybe here, because there's a lot of talk about flaps, maybe we want to talk a little bit, Ben, about why does it make such a difference with 5 degrees of flaps? Like what's the up with that?
Yeah, and it's a good question because a lot of people have asked that. A typical takeoff flap setting is around flap 5, which is a relatively low flap setting compared to like a landing flap, which would be flap 30 or 40, which is how many degrees of flap you would have selected. And the question is, well, how can an airplane go from flying safely with just 5 degrees of flap to crashing with no flap? And the reason for that is that airliner wings are designed to be efficient at high altitude, high airspeed flight. So typically they need to be sort of thin, pointy, and very aerodynamically efficient at high speed flight, at high Mach numbers. That makes them not very good for flying at slow speed. So to allow for that, we can change the shape of the wing. For a low speed wing, we need short, fat, thick wings that can generate a lot of lift at low airspeed. So by extending the flaps, we can change the shape of the wing. Now, just by going to flap 5, it changes what we call the camber of the wing enough that it can generate sufficient lift to get airborne at takeoff weights at much slower airspeed, say typically 160, 170 knots, maybe less if you're lighter. Whereas if you are what we call clean, i.e. the flaps are up, then that wing is designed for high speed flight. And it will need a minimum airspeed at that kind of weight of over 220, 230, even maybe 240 knots. So we're talking maybe a 50, 60, even 70 knot difference between taking off with our takeoff flaps 5 or 10 and with flaps up. And without the flaps there, you're going to try and rotate. The aircraft will probably pitch up. It will probably leave the ground because we're in something called ground effect, where we have this pressure bubble underneath the aircraft, and it will just sort of get into the air. But once it gets above what we call the ground effect, the wings are just going to go, no, there's just not enough lift here to overcome the weight of the aircraft. And it will kind of stay there, which is what we saw with the Spanair crash. And it will just get to a point where it just cannot climb. And unfortunately crashed into the departure end of the runway and beyond. So that's how important flaps are for takeoff.
Yeah, and it should be mentioned here that the flaps in this case involves 2 sets of high lift devices. Yeah. So it's both the trailing edge flaps, which is at the back of the wing. That's what you normally see if you're looking out the window. When you're flying, you see that they extend backwards and down. But there is also a set of flaps in the front of the wing, on the leading edges, that also extend, and they serve exactly the same purpose. They create a difference in camber, and they create like Ben is saying, the possibility of low speed flight at higher weights. So they are absolutely crucial, and because they are so crucial, there is also several, first of all, checklists that will verify that those are properly set before takeoff. I think we check the flaps 2 or 3 times before.
At least. Yeah, at least.
So that means that they're in separate checklists. So if you miss one checklist, it's still there in the next checklist, because you just cannot, like the aircraft will not fly without it. Yeah. And then if you still, end up on the runway and you set takeoff thrust and those flaps are still not where they're supposed to be, then there is a warning system called the takeoff configuration warning, right? This is the last line of defense, and that one will make a huge amount of ruckus in the cockpit, right? You will not miss the takeoff configuration warning, and any pilot today worth its salt will, if they hear a takeoff configuration warning, immediately reject the takeoff, because it happens as soon as it's at takeoff thrust. So it's before the aircraft even starts to accelerate on the runway, you get this. So if it happens, the takeoff thrust has just been set, you can hear the engine start to spool up, and then you would just take the thrust off and the aircraft will not even have moved.
Nope.
So generally speaking, that's what happens. So it will not come on as we're up high speed or anything. Well, it will stay on if you try to. Like it will stay on then. But because we've had these horrible accidents happening before, we've learned our lesson when it comes to that. So taking off with the takeoff configuration warning blaring I would find very unlikely in any circumstance. So in the Span Air crash, for example, what happened was that the circuit breaker had been popped for that particular system, so they never got that warning. So they went through all of the Swiss cheese slices that should have stopped it, all of the checklists, all of the procedures that should have saved them, and then when the last line of defense came, it wasn't there. Right. So the aircraft manufacturers knows about this. This is hugely important. So these warning systems are made to make sure that this doesn't happen. And as you pointed out, the 787 has electronic checklists as well.
Yeah.
That you need to go through. So what we saw here, right? Because this is going to bring us in. We know that this aircraft actually got airborne, right?
Yeah.
And it got airborne pretty much where it should get airborne, halfway down the runway-ish. It climbed away because we've seen this on multiple videos. And then at about the end of the runway or something, instead of continuing to climb, it just seems like it's starting to go downwards, right?
Yeah.
So if we go, before we even get to the takeoff, right? When it comes to calculating performance for the takeoff, we for every single takeoff you do, you have to go in and do performance calculations, and that includes the weight of the aircraft, so the fact that they probably had a very high fuel load because they were going to fly all the way up to Gatwick. It includes the runway length, it includes things like the pressure, and it includes the temperature. So for this aircraft to take off, they would have done a takeoff performance calculation, and it would have been perfectly okay with 37 degrees. And it was, because they got airborne, right?
Yeah.
So here's really where the crux starts, right? This is where when I looked at this video, I just could not make sense out of it. And sometimes you have a hunch of what's happened, but I really want to emphasize here that, like I said before, we are going to learn over the next weeks and months and definitely years exactly what happened here. There are a number of different possibilities that could cause this. Can you think of any, Ben?
Yeah, there's a good number. And like you said, the takeoff performance that we do, it calculates it we do it every time we go flying, but it gives us so much margin in there, in that if that aircraft had an engine failure after takeoff, it would still have sufficient performance to climb away safely on one engine. That's how much extra performance we have built into that takeoff performance. And the fact, as you said, Petter, that it got airborne, that everything there seemed good. If it wasn't, we would have seen what we saw in Span Air. If the takeoff performance was not calculated correctly, or they didn't have the flaps, it's very likely they would never have got off the runway or would have crashed within the airfield boundary. So to get the aircraft to do what we saw, one thing sprung to mind for me would be a human error. Now, so we're not saying this is what happened at all. It's just one possible out of many. Would be the first thing we do when we get airborne is we retract the gear. Sorry, we get
You see?
Yeah. Yes, there you go. Yes, got flaps on the brain now. But yeah, the very first thing we do, we confirm we've got a positive rate of climb, and then we raise the gear because we don't want the gear anymore, because all it does is add drag. So we get the gear up. Now, in a previous airline that I worked for, I saw a scenario where the gear was called up, but the first officer went for the flap lever and went to select the flap up. Now, the captain at the time spotted it and no, and went down for the gear, and the gear was correct. And what was interesting during the debrief of that was the captain asked the FO, why did you do that? Why did that happen? And for those of you that don't know, to try and prevent this, airliners build in a very basic fundamental design change for both the gear and the flap lever. So the flap lever, for example, looks and feels like a wing, like a flap. And it's actually designed so it looks like a flap lever, so it makes it easy, to feel it, as opposed to a gear lever, which is that controls the wheels, is shaped much more circular and is actually shaped like a wheel itself. So when you're reaching for it, they feel like what you're saying. So these things shouldn't really happen, but yet they have happened in the past. And during the debrief, when the captain said, it's a mistake, we corrected it, there was no foul. Why did you do it? And the FO, I think, was just as flabbergasted as everybody else. He said, I genuinely don't know. I genuinely can't tell you why I went for the flap and not the gear. And sometimes it's just a mistake, isn't it, Bella? Sometimes we just get this short circuit in our brain. We're thinking about something else, or we're in a high workload event. And we make a mistake.
You have to remember that there's a lot of things that needs to be done, and both retracting the gear and retracting the flaps is part of what needs to be done. I've seen actually a YouTube video, a YouTube clip that went viral a while back. Where this was a Cessna 172, I think, a Cessna 172 RG, as in retractable gear variant. That had just landed and was going to do a touch and go, or possibly even a full stop landing. And the instructor was sitting in the left seat, and once they had landed and they were rolling out, the instructor said, well done, flaps up. And you could hear the pilot student like, check, gear up, and took the gear up while they were on the ground. So the aircraft just fell down, and then obviously the instructor started swearing and stuff. But it is the perfect example of that type of like mismatch that can happen, right? And the interesting bit is that like we said, that is one possibility. Now, there's so many other possibilities here as well, that this is why we don't want to speculate on what happened here. Because, for example, a similar thing could happen if you have a dual engine failure.
Yeah, right. For sure.
So a single engine failure would not give this, because as you pointed out, a single engine failure, the performance is made for that. So you suppose if you lose one engine, you compensate for it with a rudder, which I think is done automatically actually on the 787, and then you continue to climb slower, a lot slower, but you still continue to climb even with this temperature. But a dual engine failure obviously will not do that. And there's a lot of speculation out there about the ram air turbine, the RAT, being deployed. Now, from the videos that I have seen, it is impossible to judge that.
Yeah.
Right? People are saying, well, you can hear it on the noise. You can't, because you don't know what kind of camera that has been filming it, and the audio quality can be super bad. You cannot see it on the videos either, because the videos are pixelated. They're being compressed when they're being uploaded to X and to YouTube and everything. So you get this kind of I don't know what they're called, when you get this pixelated around moving objects, artifacts. And these artifacts can appear to look like something that is not. So, could it be? But like I said, so you have pilot error, you have dual engine failure. There can also be something unknown. We don't know what we don't know, basically. So there could be a technical malfunction with the flight controls for whatever we know. This is why YouTubers and people on social media that goes out and say, we know this because the flaps were up and this is why they did this. The risk of doing that is that first of all, you can make yourself look like an asshole, to be perfectly honest. But that's not the worst. The worst is that when a particular theory grabs hold and people say, well, yeah, that aircraft, that crash happened because of this, I saw it on social media, you actually take away from the relearning. And the relearning you will only get when the air accident investigators have sifted through the wreckage, found the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, downloaded it, looked at all of the parameters. We will see and hear about that within a month from now, with the initial preliminary report will come out. And when they've gone through everything, they will be able to give us an exact sequence of events, which is what I do on Mentor Pilot. When I tell you stories from there, I read from the final report, which has gone through everything and has made sure that we can actually learn from this, and we learn the correct lessons. So for us to sit here and say, like, pilot error, it will not help. If it turns out to be a technical error, then that's a lesson missed for a lot of people. But what you're saying, a flap retraction out of by mistake, for example, yes, it would look like that most likely, because an aircraft that is super heavy, filled to the brim with fuel in a really hot environment. Like you said, the difference between flaps 1 or flaps 5 and flaps up is maybe 50, 60 knots. And an aircraft cannot sustain flight if it's 60 knots below the minimum safe speed.
No, and it's even conceivable that it was then later, whoever they spotted it, they started to extend flaps again. So when they find the wreckage, the flaps are partially extended. We don't know. There's too many variables, but it's certainly a possible explanation. As you said, engine failures, contaminated fuel, all of this is a possible one, and it's worth a lot of people talking about the rats and the ram air turbine. It's worth maybe just explaining what that is.
Yeah.
In that it's called a ram air turbine, a RAT, and what it is, a lot of aircraft have it. The 737 doesn't have it, but it's designed that if you lost all of your electronic power and the engines power all of your electronics, if you lose your engines, you lose that. Then what happens is the ram air turbine will automatically extend into the airflow and acts like a wind generator or a wind turbine. It will just spin in the air, and that will just supply you with the bare minimum of your electrics that you need to fly. And there's reports that you can see it, reports that you can't. I certainly can't see for sure. But yeah, that's what a RAD is.
Because as some people have pointed out as well, another thing is to turn off both engines by mistake. That's the thing. This is why speculating is so hard, because it's not. There's too many variables, and with only video evidence from mobile phones, you can't get anything from what you see. You can't get anything from I can't see the heat signature from the engines going out because after a certain point, nothing like that. So be very careful. Basically, I typically use I use ground news. I said that a couple of times for watching, because it gives you, if you go to ground news and you check it out, you'll get loads of different news variants, and you can go in and you can watch all of them, and from that you can kind of get a more complete picture. So this is kind of I would definitely not go into X and read on there and try to figure out what's happened. Try to find reputable news sources that comes out and doesn't speculate, because at this point no one really knows. We don't, and no one else does. My team will be working on trying to, whenever we get confirmed data, we put it out on mentorpilot.com. And we already have an article that's being updated there. So that's one way of getting valuable information. Ground news is another. I think there's a link to it here in the chat. But that's kind of what we know so far, isn't it? I mean, is there anything that we want to?
Is it worth talking about? Because one thing to point out here is that everything we do from a day-to-day basis as an airline pilot, whether it's checklists, the way we read them, the discipline involved with it, is written in blood. It's there because something has happened in the past, and aviation is evolved as a result of that, which is why it's the safest form of transport. And if there is some kind of human error here or some kind of technical failure, whatever that may be, we can rest assured that there will be changes to training, to procedures, to prevent this from happening again.
For sure. Now, there was one thing that we haven't mentioned, actually, that's worth mentioning, and that is the fact that, according to early reports, there was a Mayday call. The pilots might have done a Mayday call. I haven't seen that confirmed yet, but there is a possibility. And of course, going from the logic of aviate, navigate, communicate, which is the golden rule in aviation, communicate is the very last thing that you do. So, getting a Mayday call in is strange, but it's not unthinkable. It could be a backbone reaction when you just realize that, I've lost control of this. Mayday, mayday, mayday.
Yeah.
But it would be really interesting to hear the recording for that, because from a recording like that, you will definitely hear any alarms going off in the background, for example. So that could be really, really interesting to hear.
Yeah, and one that would give it away a lot would be a stick shaker. You could hear that certainly in the background. So if a stick shaker is an indication to us that the aircraft is about to stall or is stalled, which means the wings aren't providing the sufficient lift, the angle of attack is too high. So you would definitely hear that in the background of a radio call, most likely. So that'll be interesting if it does come out. It's worth also talking about maybe what are airlines doing when this happens. When a horrible event like this happens, there's a protocol in place. Do you want? What's your experience with that, Petter?
So I'm not an expert on this. I'm going to be perfectly honest and say, this is an airline's worst nightmare. But they have strict procedures for when these kind of things happens. Whenever an accident happens to an airline, they will go into an emergency mode. Generally speaking, there's a list of people that needs to be notified immediately, which includes the management team, certain emergency coordinators, because it's super important that, first of all, that obviously that the rescue attempt is being done correctly, but also that the families of the people on board the flight is being taken care of and being shielded away from the press, for example. So I would imagine that something like that, a crisis center has been set up both at the airport of departure and on arrival, because that's where the families will be turning up, and they will then be taken off to a specific place and get information before the press gets the information and things like that. And there will also be a lot of different emergency protocols that will be put into place specifically for this, right? So exactly what those are, like I said, I'm not an expert on it, but this is a nightmare scenario. But again, it's something that all airlines by law has to be prepared for and has to execute correctly. Yep. Now I saw one question here just flickering by, because there's thousands of questions in the chat, but Pete Christie sent a super chat, and he's asking if we could talk a little bit more about the survivor that was sitting in seat 11A. Apparently, we've just had confirmed that there was a survivor and that he likely sat there. And he said, how could he have escaped this? Report said that he jumped from the plane. I mean, the aircraft went down at a fairly low speed, relatively speaking. As in, you could see that the aircraft was coming down in a, I would say, semi-controlled manner. It wasn't tipped over one wing, for example. It wasn't stalled nose down into the ground. So possibly it impacted with the landing gear still extended. At least that's what it looked like. Landing gear takes up quite a lot of the impact forces. So yeah, if you're really, really lucky, which this person apparently was, you could end up sitting in a seat where after the crash has happened, you have openings in the hull around you and you can't jump out. You're not going to jump out in speed, obviously. You're going to jump out after the accident has happened. And 11A, maybe that's pretty far forward in the aircraft. So, it will be ahead of the fuel tanks. The fuel tanks is most likely where the explosion happened, because it was, loaded to the brim of fuel. So,
yeah. And also, I think it's worth noting that often a crash, the nose is one of the first places to have the impact. But because of the high nose attitude, the tail looked like it hit first. So the front was probably the most likely place to survive. It's a good question.
You're reading stuff.
Yeah, I'm just looking at some good questions coming through, actually. So Paul Kelly's asked a question here. We're talking about the flap retraction, weren't we? Accidentally retracting flaps after takeoff instead of the gear. And would the flaps retraction happen that quickly and cause such an immediate problem? So, yeah, I guess the timing from that seems to work quite well. They begin to retract pretty much, immediately, don't they? I haven't flown the 787, but the 737, I've never timed it, but I'm, rough estimates, what do you reckon, Peter? 10 seconds from selecting flap 5 to flap up?
Yeah, probably a little bit more, 10, 15 seconds.
Yeah. But the moment they start retracting, you're now reducing the surface area of the wing, which reduces lift. You're reducing that curvature of the wing, which reduces lift. So the moment they start retracting, your lift is being reduced. And every second that goes by, that lift is getting reduced even more. Yeah. So it would be noticeable very, very quickly. Yeah,
and the way that you would notice it really is that way. You'd probably be increasing the pitch in order to try to, you're climbing away, and you keep, as we take off, generally speaking, on the 737-800, but probably on the 787, you will have a nose attitude of between 12 and 16 degrees, like 15, 16 degrees normally on this. If you really, really have it, can be a little bit lower, but you're used to rotating and sitting at that. Now, if, for example, the flaps would be starting to retract, you'd need to, in order to continue the climb, which you monitor, you'd need to increase the pitch more and more and more, because that's the only way to increase the lift from the wings that are now becoming effectively smaller and smaller. So you'd get that kind of nose up thing happening until you stall or you pitch the nose down, in which case, either case, you're going to start going down. Yeah.
And a logical question here from Alfred is that even if there was accidental flap retraction, surely they could just power out of it. And the question here or the point here is, it's not really a question of power. It's a question of lift, and it's the wings that generate the lift. The engines provide the thrust to power you through the air to get the sufficient airspeed over the wings that give you lift. And no matter, okay, if you go out with like rocket power, you don't need wings, but on a normal aircraft, if your lift is reduced to that extent, you haven't got the sufficient power to just keep flying. Yep. It's all about airspeed at this point and angle of attack.
Yeah, and there's a delay, and also, like we said, the engine thrust that we have is balanced to take exactly the weight that we have, and being able to fly with one engine in case one engine would go. But there's not enough engine power there in order to I need another 60 knots stat. No, you won't get that. It would even in level flight, it would take you quite a long time to accelerate 60 knots.
Yeah.
So even if you had a lot of excess thrust, let's say you were taking off with an empty aircraft on a cold day, you still have problems to do that, and I think that it probably wouldn't even be possible.
No. And the other thing to bear in mind is, because it was so hot, the engines aren't performing as optimally as they would do if it was cold, because they've got, their job is really to compress air to burn, and hot air is less dense, so it can't compress it quite as much. So again, everything's not optimal there. So yeah, unfortunately, that just wouldn't work.
Yeah. Glenn is asking here in a super chat. Thanks, Glenn. What's wrong with speculating as long as you say it? And I kind of been into that already. This is something I've talked about. Like, for example, I will be creating videos about this. It will be more videos coming out on Mentor now, and also our podcast, Captain Speaking. This is an emergency. This will go out on the podcast as well, but we will do a specific podcast about this once we learn more, right? Yeah. So, and in that, I will be going into more and more details as we know more and more. But again, if I would go out with the reach that we have through Mentor Pilot and Mentor Now, and I would say the wrong things, then the wrong things might permeate through all of the followers here, everyone that's out there, and potentially also into the airline industry. So my colleagues might be watching this, and if I would say the wrong thing backed by the wrong facts, then there is a possibility that I might actually do real damage. I could be teaching new first officers something that's completely wrong, right? Something that actually makes them less safe rather than more safe. And that's why speculation is wrong. It's not wrong by anyone. Like, you guys are free to speculate as much as you like. It's your free speech. You can do that. But when you come up to a certain amount of reach and you have a certain reputation, you just cannot. It's not ethical to do that. So that's why it's super important for us to just show that these are the threats. These are generic threats. These are possibilities. But until we know more, we just do not know what happens, and that's why.
No. What else have we got here?
Lot to choose from, unfortunately.
A lot to choose from. The question here: does a 787 have MCAS? Something that the Max was very famous for, and I think a lot of aircraft do have a form of MCAS. It wouldn't surprise me. I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me if the 78 has some form of software that would prevent. It's designed to prevent a stall from happening, but I don't think that's going to be the issue as a root cause here at all.
No.
What about this? We've kind of covered. Can you stop and reverse flap retraction? Does it finish? Does it have to finish before you then select flap? And the answer to that is yes, you can do. That you can just, if you accidentally selected it up, there's nothing preventing you from selecting it back. The longer you leave it, the more dangerous it becomes. Yeah. But there's nothing there preventing you from selecting it immediately that you realize the error.
Yeah. But then again, as we said, this might have absolutely nothing to do with this particular case.
No, nothing to do with this. No, absolutely. It's just in that scenario, it would result in this particular outcome.
Correct. So John Koldusek is asking, once again, thank you for the support. Can you elaborate a bit more on how the cockpit would look like if you try to retract flaps below the clean stall speed in detail? One thing that would come up is the minimum maneuver speed, the yellow band, together with the red and black Barber's poles, which is the stall speed. So because that is the stall management yaw damper computer who's continuously calculating at what angle of attack the aircraft will stall. So if you retract the flaps those kind of indications on your primary flight display, where we see our speed, they will start to reach as the flap retraction. Oh, sorry, start to go up as the flap retracts. So you will definitely see that all of a sudden you're getting closer and closer to a stall, and eventually you will get into it with all of the stall warnings that will come with that, including stick shaker, which Ben talked about before.
Yeah. And I think from a pilot's perspective, if that happened, they would be unaware of the error that was made. And that in itself can be confusing. You're climbing away what you feel is normally with the correct pitch attitude. And all of a sudden on your airspeed tape on your instrument, you're just seeing your stall speed just coming up and up and up, getting closer. We have something called a PLI, a pitch limit indicator, which shows you on your attitude indicator the pitch attitude at which you would stall at. And you'll see that coming down to your current pitch attitude. All of this is going to be confusing in an already high workload phase of flight. It's a lot to kind of process as to what's going on, all the while the aircraft is not handling how you would expect it to. So it would be a huge amount of overload and confusion in a very short period of time if that were the case.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions on your side, Pet? Have you got some there that pick out? Do you want to talk about how this may affect Boeing?
Yeah. So we saw that. I haven't seen it myself, but I heard my team reporting that they dropped immediately, like 7% the stock value immediately when this hit. That tends to happen. You tend to have an immediate like backbone reaction to the stocks, but realistically, as we learn more about what this was all about, if it turns out that it's technical, it will have a huge impact because the Boeing 787 is one of the most important. It's the flagship of Boeing at the moment, at least until the Boeing 777X is up and running. So any technical issue that has to do with the Boeing 787 would be a huge deal for Boeing. If it turns out to not have anything to do with technical but be human factors related instead, it shouldn't have any effect, which means that the stock price should bounce back up again. Yep. But again, no one knows. This is just a backbone reaction of the market at the moment. And Boeing did send out a tweet saying that they're fully cooperative with the investigation. They are sending support teams down to Air India. So they will be doing their absolute best to get to the bottom of this for sure.
Yeah, and if it is deemed to be a pilot error or human error, it may not affect Boeing, but what it will do is it will ripple through training departments of the various airlines to ensure that this cannot happen again.
Absolutely. So Everything Racing is sending in a question as well. So he says, the only survivor of Air India Flight 171 quoted, 30 seconds after takeoff, there was a loud noise and then the plane crashed. It all happened so quickly. I doubt that there is any a quote from the survivor at this point. I would be very surprised if he's talking to the press already. But if he is, eyewitness accounts are very, very poor. Generally speaking, whenever you ask eyewitnesses who've seen an accident, they will always say that they saw a fireball or they heard an explosion. And that it's the human brains basically just reinventing what they saw afterwards to fit the narrative of what they're talking about. So eyewitness accounts from passengers, even on board the flight, unless it has to do with smell or something like that, it's going to be very, very hard to use as hard evidence. This is why the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder is so important.
Yeah.
Because it gets called hard facts.
Another interesting point here from Fullcat. What is the command language here when retracting gear or retracting flap? Is it gear up and then flaps up later on? Because it's worth pointing out that the gear is raised immediately after takeoff, as we said, and the flaps are typically raised or retracted generally about 1,000 feet above the ground or above as we start to accelerate. So we will begin to accelerate, and once we're above a minimum speed, we would then select the next lower flap setting until we retract all of our flaps. But I think that's airline dependent, but certainly in our airline, it's the airline I fly for and I have flown for in the past. In other airlines, it's the same. So it's gear up, and when it's the correct time, it will be flaps up, but we check the speed first. So we'll say speed checked, flaps up, and then we would retract the flaps. So there is that, but again, that's probably airline dependent, SOP dependent.
But it is super important to point out that while we do, like the gear comes up with positive rate. That's the way that we do it. We rotate, and then once we have positive rate indicated on the altimeter, plus all of the other instruments, so you have the correct attitude, the correct IVSI indication, which is the vertical situation indicator, then you take the gear up. And that happens seconds after departure. Right? Generally speaking, we're talking V1, rotate, positive rate, gear up. 2-3 seconds. something like that. In when both engines are working and everything looks okay. So it's literally. Yeah, maybe you're at 200 feet climbing toward 400 feet. And this seemed to have, according to ADS-B data, so flight radar 24 and so on, they reached about 400 feet before they started descending again. And the speed was around 170 knots.
Yeah, which would tie in. And it's one of those trigger responses we spoke about earlier, isn't it? You hear, tell any pilot, positive rate, the first thing they're going to think is gear up. But there's obviously, it's not unthinkable that a human could accidentally select the wrong thing, as we've discussed before.
Correct, and that would explain then why the gear was out
down
on all of the videos that we can see. So like that, there are things that ties together, but also similarly, you wouldn't take the gear up if you have a problem.
No.
So that's the thing.
It depends on the problem, I guess, doesn't it?
But if let's say that you experience a dual engine failure.
Yeah.
Right. You wouldn't take the gear up.
No.
Because then you're going to hit the ground.
Yeah.
And you want that gear to be able to take
For
up
sure.
anything. So that's another thing that, again, as you can see, there's so many unknowns here that you can't really go in and say, well, this has happened because I saw that.
Yeah.
No, it's completely dependent on exactly what transpired inside of the cockpit at the time.
Yeah, for sure.
3 Greens is saying, studying for my CPL aerodynamics exam. Well, best of luck. Currently, density altitude around 3,500 feet and only half of the takeoff distance available being used. Sound like Swiss cheese. Pitch up at the end would have massively induced drag plus gear out. Not good at all. Yeah, but that's... We covered this in the beginning of the live stream. They did not start from the middle of the runway. They did backtrack. That's been confirmed now. So they used the full runway length. So that's not really an issue, even though you are correct in what you're saying, if that would have been the case.
Yeah. We spoke about fuel contamination. Question here from VKM. I heard of possible fuel contamination like Cathay 780. I think it's unlikely to happen so suddenly. Yeah. It's so many. I mean, it happened with in the UK a good few years ago now on an A320 coming out of Gatwick. I think they put something like 100 times the amount of anti-fungus in the fuel tank than they should have done. You covered that one, yeah, that's it. And the engine started coughing and spluttering, and they didn't flame out completely. Thankfully, they managed to nurse this aeroplane all the way around and get it safely back on the ground again. But yeah.
The risk or the chance of you taxiing out to the engines working perfectly, setting takeoff thrusts, and then taking off, and then all of a sudden fuel contamination would kill both engines simultaneously is super, super low. Yeah. Right? It is super low. Is it impossible? No. And this is why but it is very, they tend to, when you have fuel contamination, remember jet engines are pretty like they're efficient machines. Yeah. They will, since the only thing they really do is burn. Right, they burn the fuel and then they use the expansion of the gases to drive the whole machine forward. It means that they will continue to burn as long as they can. They might not burn as efficiently, so they might start to stutter and they might start to get compressor stalls and stuff like that. But they will continue to burn for quite a long time, even with contaminated fuel. They don't just shut off.
No, they're super resilient. So never say never, but it's unlikely.
Yeah. Von Leonor Espiritu is saying this was the first hull loss of a 787 and the first fatal crash, and indeed it seems to be. There was an accident, the ANA accident about a year ago, also involved a 787, but of course that was a collision on the runway, and everyone survived that accident, but the aircraft was destroyed. Now this, from what I have been able to find, is the first real hull loss of a Boeing 787, which is a major deal. This is why this is going to reverberate through the industry for sure. This is probably going to be one of the biggest stories in the aviation world this year.
Yeah. But it also, I mean, the 78, although it's their flagship, it has been out for quite some time. It's got a lot of airtime, hasn't it? So it unlike newer models where there could be a new problem, presenting itself, I think it's unlikely that there's something now that nobody knew about that could suddenly manifest itself in this way. Never say never, of course, but it's not that new. It's not that new. It's not like the 737 MAX that was a relatively new airframe at the time.
Yeah, exactly, containing loads of different new systems.
Yeah.
So there's also mention here of can you address the people killed or injured on the ground? Say for 9/11, might this involve one of the highest rate of ground casualties? Potentially. If the aircraft went straight into a residential building, if there was a lot of people inside, this was midday, so it's hard to say, right?
Yeah.
But we are. The last count I saw was around 40 injured. There was no confirmations about fatalities yet, but I'm sure that will come. So I mean, this is a horrible, horrible story. And my thoughts when I saw this, you get shivers and you think, poor families. This is it's just terrible.
Yeah.
And it's all of the people that's waiting in Gatwick and all of the people back home in India. I cannot even imagine.
No, it's just awful. And unfortunately, with any kind of incident on takeoff, the aircraft is brimming with fuel, isn't it? Which just makes it 10 times worse than if it was, empty later down the line, 10 hours later.
Yeah. So Chris is saying, if you missed all of the checklist alarms and you started the takeoff climb with no flaps, would putting 5 degrees of flaps in that stage help?
Yeah. Well, it depends when. But if you realize the error and you then select the flap, again, it's what we said in reverse now. Every second that goes by, that wing is increasing in area. It's increasing the camber. It's helping you. Yeah. So every second that goes by with those flaps extending, the better you're going to be. So it's not once you've done it, it's game over. It is reversible potentially if caught early enough.
Yep. But I have to really emphasize this. If you're a pilot out there and you're watching this, if you hear that takeoff configuration alarm, the thing to do is reject. It's not to try to set the flaps and continue the takeoff.
No.
And I'm saying that because back in the day, back before even I started, people had a tendency to do those kind of things. So that was more before the Spanair crash, especially people who have just been slacking off and they haven't done the checklist correctly and ended up realizing that they hadn't selected flaps 1, for example, would just continue and select flaps 1 during the takeoff roll and just wait for that takeoff configuration alarm to go away. But fortunately, especially since we introduced OFDM, that's the operational flight data monitoring system that basically monitors everything that we do and highlights if something is out of order. Once that was implemented, which I personally think is one of the best safety measures ever invented, people knew that this was going to be recorded. And if you took off with that, and you did so without hurting anyone, that would go straight to the OFDM facilitator. That would highlight that as potentially hugely dangerous thing to do. And then your chief pilot would be involved. Like you'd have an email or a call from your chief pilot coming home saying, can you just confirm what you just did there? And just the knowledge of that has helped a lot of people. You would think that just survival instinct would do that. Yeah. But the fact is that they have someone spying over their shoulder, looking at what you do, is actually hugely effective when it comes to sticking to standard operating procedures.
Yeah, and the point here to remember is that the argument might be, well, you've corrected it. Why not just keep going? Why the disruption? But the point here is if you've missed all of the potential areas to whether you should have checked your flaps and you didn't, what else have you missed? Yes, you fixed that one other problem, but what else have you missed? So carrying on that takeoff is clearly going to be unsafe. So the correct decision always would be to reject.
And in that case, whenever you've had a takeoff, you try to do a takeoff, and you've forgotten to set flaps or slats or the takeoff, the stabilized trim or whatever, the safest thing to do is actually to taxi back to the gate.
Yep.
And investigate. And I would say that you should be pulling this CVR circuit breaker as well, because this will lead to an investigation.
Yeah, because we want to know why, don't we? It's not pointing fingers. We need to learn from this. How, with all of these procedures, did this happen?
Exactly. This is one of the leading principles, which I'm trying to get through in my videos, that in a just culture, right? And a just culture means that you're not going to be punished for honest mistakes. You will be punished if you do something voluntarily. You take shortcuts, so you're basically taking the piss. Like that will not be tolerated. But if you try to do your best, you make a mistake, then a just culture would state that you protect the data, you write a report about what you perceived happened, and then there would be an investigation that will, find out that maybe this airport was unsuitable for some reason. Maybe there was undue stresses at some certain points that led pilots to make mistakes like this. And this is how we go forward as in the airline business. It is by learning from every single mistake. Whenever people feel afraid about reporting anything, you lose all of this. Because people say, no, don't mention that. We're going to get in trouble. We're not going to even lift that to management level. And with that, whatever problem that was there, that was clearly the root cause to this, will just fester and fester until something really terrible happens.
Yeah. And it's worth remembering here that when all of these incidents happen, if it is pilot error, away from this particular incident, is that those pilots rocked up for work that day, as we do every day, with best intentions, never expecting to make these kind of mistakes. Even as obvious or as crazy as these mistakes are, something led up to them making those mistakes. So if we can highlight what was the road to this error manifesting itself, we can prevent it. We can prevent it from happening again. And that's the key.
Absolutely. And I think, do we have any more questions here that's coming up that we should definitely cover?
I think so. I think we've covered everything I can see on my side. But if you do have questions, then feel free to pin them in here, pop them in.
Yeah, so it's super important that whatever questions you have, genuine questions, just put them in either here or go to the Captain's Speaking podcast. It's actually a new YouTube channel that we've started that just does podcasts like this. It's me and Ben who will be discussing things in a like this non-scripted, honest way, and we are doing it bi-weekly at the moment. It's probably going to go to weekly. So we had an episode that was going to be released today, but we're doing this instead because we felt that there was a public demand for this. But put your questions in there, and we will capture the questions that we think this is definitely worth discussing, and we will include that in the podcast. So do that, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. Good. I think we've covered everything I can see, Petter. Yeah.
Good. Before we go, I just want to say we just had a couple of Patreons that signed up today. Randy and Peter, thanks a lot for that. After this, I am going to go over and I'm doing a Zoom hangout, which I do a couple of times a month anyway, but I'm doing it on Patreon. So we are able to do this. We're able to start up new channels and do this kind of videos, thanks to the support largely from my Patreons and sponsors. So I just want to send a huge thanks to all of you guys out there that are watching this, that are supporting the channel, so that me and Ben can continue to create this. And I hope that you enjoy that Ben is doing some of the reporting on Mentor Now as well.
Yeah,
I'm super stoked to have you with me, man.
It's great fun. Yeah, it's great fun, and it's awesome to be part of the Mentor Now family. I mean, everyone there is so kind of positive, and it's just such a cool thing to be involved with. So yeah. Good fun.
Yeah, you should. I wish people could have seen what happened when when the news hit this morning about this horrible accident. The whole team got together and okay, so how can we? What should we do now in order to try to get the correct information out? How can we sort out the bad information from the good information to make sure that we don't say anything that is that is going to be bad? Mm-hmm. And then we have been starting, we're putting posts out on X, on Instagram. You are putting the things out on Instagram. By the way, you should go check out Airline Pilot Performance on Instagram. Do it now.
Yeah.
Ben does a lot of instructional posts directed mainly towards pilots, which is a little bit more technical.
Yeah.
But it's super, super interesting as well. But the whole team came together, and you will see now that as the days goes along and we learn more, there's going to be more information coming out. And the information that we are going to share is going to be informational and accurate. That's what we do. So thanks a lot to all of you Patreons out there. And if you have direct questions to me, you can actually sign up on Patreon now for free for 7 days. And if you do, you can join the Zoom that I'm having after this, right? You can go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. Then you don't have to pay anything. You can just join up with the Zoom call, which is going to happen in 30 minutes from now. So I'm going to need to get a little bit of food.
Cool.
And on that note, Ben, thank you very much for being here and taking your time. I hope that all of you out there got what you wanted from this live stream. And if you don't, I'm sorry. And like I said, we will try to keep you informed. Any last words, Ben?
No. It's been good to kind of answer some questions and just discuss it between all of us here. So yeah, thanks for having us.
Perfect. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Have a good night.